Welcome to the Farm to Fork Camp cooking video for the Piedmont region. Jackie, that really was a cool facility we toured.
I'll tell you what, the Piedmont Research Station was amazing, but I didn't get to go on that tour. Can you tell me a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so we were lucky enough to have the assistant manager of the dairy facility actually tour us around and show us their whole entire operation, and it really was amazing. We got to see some of the baby calves they were working with, as well as some of the ones that were actually producing a lot of the milk already.
That is so cool. So since we went to a dairy, what are we going to be doing for our recipe this week?
Yeah, so this recipe is actually a vegetarian recipe that we're going to do, and a lot of times when I think about dairy, I think of it as a source of protein for those that do follow a vegetarian type diet. So one of the things that was really great was that the assistant manager said that if we wanted to support dairy and support some of the things that they were doing, it was to actually buy dairy and buy it at your local grocery store, or your local facility where you get your groceries. And so we've got 3 different types today that we're going to use of dairy, and that are all going to go into this recipe. Yeah, for this recipe today, we've got 3 types of dairy so we can support that, that operation. And so we've got cheese, we've got half and half, as well as milk. And so all of these are great dairy products, and they're going to all go into this recipe. So I guess you probably want to know what this recipe is, right?
I absolutely do. I'm sorry.
This recipe is going to be a potato soup. And so I always like to do recipes that can be modified or adjusted, and depending on what you may have available. And so we've got a lot of fresh veggies, we've got some broth, and we're going to do our milk base to have our dairy in there. This is going to be a really great recipe. But the first thing first is we got to make sure we wash up all our veggies and we start getting them ready. So what do you say we start by peeling those potatoes?
Sounds great. Let's do it. All right, I've got my nice washed potato here, and I'm using a peeler. And if you notice, I'm going to go and I'm going to start, and I want to have at the top of the potato and work my way down. And I'm going to go, since I'm right-handed, I'm going to go to the right side, so I'm going to keep rotating the potato as I go down. And I'm not worried if I leave a little bit of skin behind. That's okay. I'm just trying to get the most of the skin off, and I'll catch the edges. And if I get to an eye, most people might not know this about a potato peeler, but there's actually an eye on there. So like if you have an eye on the potato, you can actually core it right out and make that a clean cut. But I'm going to I think this recipe calls for 6 potatoes, so we're going to go through here and get some of these done. But now I think I'm going to see if Greg can show us how to use a paring knife in case you don't have a peeler.
Yeah, so if you don't have a peeler, you can use a paring knife to take the skin off of pretty much anything. And the key here is to have really good control and to do this as safely as possible. And so you'll see that I'm being very slow and deliberate about how I'm working the knife around. And I'm also not making very aggressive type cuts, and I'm going very slow and very gradual. And that's the key when you're using this type of technique. Like I said, peeler is going to be your number 1 here, but if you don't have a peeler, you can try this technique. But always be safe and take your time. All right, so now that Jackie has got all of our potatoes peeled, we're going to start to chop up all of our different veggies. So I'll start by chopping up some of these potatoes and getting them ready. The key with any type of stew or any type of dish where you're going to be putting all of the things into one pot is to try to make sure that these things are roughly around the same size, because if we have big huge hunks of potatoes or big huge hunks of carrots, as you'll see us cut in a minute, they could cook at different times, and so we want to make sure that they're relatively the same so you don't get a raw bite in one of your bites and something mushy in the other. So I'll just continue to break these down, and like with anything that we would cut, we want to try to break it into manageable pieces, and especially with potatoes, you may see that it's sticking to the knife, and that's because of the starch that is in these potatoes, and that's causing it to have that sticky type of texture. And so make sure that you take your time and that you're careful when cutting up potatoes. But I'm just going to break it down into sheets, and then I'm going to make cross cuts, and I'm breaking it down into little matchsticks, and then I'm going to go back to my chop. And like I said, this is a rough chop. This isn't a fine chop. And part of these potatoes will actually be blended up later on in our recipe, so they don't have to be absolutely perfect. All right, so next thing I'll do is I will go ahead and break down our celery. And with the celery, it does have 2 ends that I will cut off, and you'll see me take off the unedible or the portions that we don't want in the recipe. And mostly is because these leaves are not really super flavorful or don't add a lot to the dish, and sometimes can be a little bitter, as well as the white portion that you see at the end that looks maybe even a little bit dirty on the tips. And so I'll take those off, and then just like anything, that I'm going to break it down into manageable pieces and manageable sizes, and then I'm going to create some matchsticks and go back to a rough chop. And if you notice, I'm starting to really create those same similar sized pieces. And then for the last thing that I'm going to chop up here before moving on to the next portion of our recipe is I'm going to chop up the carrot. And carrots, as we've seen earlier, we took the peel off of our potatoes, and it's a little bit different with the carrot because it actually has kind of a peel as well. But for this recipe, I'm actually going to leave the peel on of the carrot because of the way that we're going to cook it, and I try to leave the peel on of all of the veggies as much as I can because it offers so many different nutrients and vitamins. And so with the carrot, it's actually going to add a little bit of extra fiber. And because these are nice, really pretty carrots, that they're not going to offer a lot of odd flavors because of the peel. So I'm just going to break these down, get them into small manageable pieces, and we'll be good to go.
Greg, you did a great job chopping all these vegetables, and you know, my wife makes a lot of potato soups, and she likes it when all the vegetables will fit on your soup spoon, so when you're going in for a bite, you get a little bit of everything. I know she'd be very happy with these vegetables.
Absolutely. I love the way that everything turned out. And so now what I've done is I've went ahead and put my pot here on medium high. And so what we're going to do is some of these vegetables are a little bit harder and a little bit tougher, and we want to soften those up and kind of also create a little bit of extra flavor. And so what I think we're going to do is we're going to put some olive oil in the bottom of our pot, and then I've also added one extra thing that we didn't show chopping up, and it's kind of a new addition to this particular recipe. And I put a little bit of fresh onion. And so if you have an onion sitting around, or half an onion, or a shallot, or something along those lines, throwing it into something like a stew or a soup is always going to bring out a little bit more flavor. Yeah,
and sometimes, you know, we're making a dish and we got leftover onion. We might freeze some, so this would be a great time to use some of those frozen leftovers in our dish.
Absolutely. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the top off here because we're not going to need that till towards the end. And I'm going to have you put a little bit of oil in there, and you can see we're already nice and hot and warm. So Jackie's going to put in, and what he's doing now is he's going to actually put in the carrots and most of the celery. And if he gets a couple potatoes in there, that's perfectly fine. But majority of the potatoes we will use in the final cooking part later on. And I'm going to go ahead and also throw in these onions here too. And so he's going to sit here and work this around and get this all prepared and kind of break it down and start to soften up some of those.
I'll keep pulling out a few of those leftovers in the bowl there.
Absolutely.
Man, can you smell that? Oh,
it smells great. And one thing I will say about when you're cooking a recipe like this, if maybe when you're cooking your recipe and it calls for, you know, say a half a cup of this or 3 carrots or whatever, all these things are a little bit different. So if we've got some carrots and some potatoes and things like that left over, we can actually freeze those and save those for another time. And so, so we don't have to use everything today.
how long normally, Greg, do you actually saute your vegetables, like, you know, before you actually start adding in your other ingredients?
Yeah, so I would say for this, we probably want to saute these for maybe about 3 to 5 minutes. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and actually add in the potato as well and let that start to kind of break down and cook a little bit too. But because the potato will soften up a little faster cooking it this way, and we don't want it to really completely mush. And so, so we'll just throw those in next, and then we'll get ready to add the rest of our ingredients. Sounds
great. I can see on the bottom of our pan, we're definitely getting some browning down there. And when you're making a soup, with those liquids, you're going to pour that up, and there's going to be a ton of extra flavor in all those beautiful colors down there.
All right, so while Jackie is continuing to saute the veggies for us, I wanted to tell you a little bit about what else is going to go into this recipe. And so for this particular recipe, we're also going to have, we've talked about the cheese and the half and half and the milk. So we're using half and half as our cream. So you can use like a heavy whipping cream, but if you have half and half maybe that you use for your coffee, it always is a great substitute for heavy whipping cream. And it actually has like a less calories overall, and so it's a little bit healthier of an option. Also too, we've got vegetable broth in this recipe. because we're going to make it as a vegetarian dish, I'm going to use vegetable broth. You could also use a beef broth, or you could use a chicken broth if you prefer those particular flavors. As always, I try to use low sodium if it's available. That just helps to decrease the amount of overall sodium in the dish. All right, those are looking really good, Jackie. Let's let it go a little bit longer, and like you said, see if those onions will get translucent. And I'd say we're probably about ready to add those potatoes. And just judging by the size of our pot that we're using here and the amount of people that we're going to be serving with this dish, we probably won't even need all of our potatoes. So we'll probably need, a majority of those, but not quite all of them. And that's something that I always say with recipes is you got to be willing to adjust on the fly as you're going through, because you never know when things will be a little bit different. And things like vegetables are never the same size.
Well, and you definitely don't want to add so much to your pan that you don't have the right amount, equal parts, because then you're going to have a mess.
Absolutely. All right, so I'd say we're probably about ready to add those rest potatoes. What do you think?
I think so. You tell me when you think we got enough in there for the size pan we've got here.
I'd say that's pretty good right there.
All righty.
Yep. And so we'll save those extra a little bit, maybe for another dish. And if we're not able to save them for another dish, you can always compost them as well. And so it's a way to use them versus just throwing them away. All right. So as Jackie continues to do that, I'm going to get everything ready. And like I said, I've already measured out my milk as well as my half and half and put it into here. And then I've also got my vegetable broth. Now, vegetable broth for this recipe, it calls for 8 total cups. And so for 8 total cups, I can look here on the back on my nutrition facts label, and it shows me that each one of these will have, these will actually have 4 cups in each one of these. So it actually measures out just perfect. So I don't even actually have to measure that.
Nice.
All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and start by adding in some of the broth. And this is another thing too, depending on the amount of veggies that you have and the amount of stew or the amount of soup that you're trying to create will dictate how much of these you'll actually use. So I've got 1 in there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add about half of this one, and then kind of look and see when all of my liquid's in there, how it looks. Because also too, some people prefer like a very brothy style soup, and then others prefer a much thicker, chunkier, creamier style soup. So it's kind of up to you what you decide to go with. And so I'm going to do these and go ahead and put in my creamed ingredients, and that's when it really starts to look like that potato soup. Starts to get that really, really pretty color.
Exactly. Well, and just look at all those, the oranges and the greens popping in there with the white, from the dairy.
And I think that looks about right for the amount of veggies that we have. And I would say I probably got another cup left in here. So we actually used around 7 cups of this. And if you find that you look at it and it's a little bit, as you make more and more of this style dish, you'll determine, oh, I want it a little creamier. So you could always add a little bit more half and half, or you could always add a little bit more of your milk if you want it to be a little whiter and a little creamier. All right, so now what we've done is Jackie's actually continued to pump the heat back up and get it to a nice simmer. And what we're going to do is at this point is I'm going to go ahead and start to add in all of my flavors. So we've got a lot of natural flavors from the fruits and from the different vegetables and all that we put in here. But I also want to go ahead and put in some Cajun seasoning. You can also use an all-purpose seasoning if you have that available. And so I'm going to go ahead and put this in. And for stews and things like this, I always say you can put it in fairly aggressively for some different ones based on the amount that you have. But also, you can always add some and then come back later and continue to add. And so that's where, with stews especially, you want to be able to taste test. And so taste test it and adjust from there. So I've got a good amount of that in there. I'm also going to go ahead and put some pepper in here. This will actually give it a nice flavor. And then I'm going to put a decent amount of salt. And so with the table salt, it really helps to bring out a lot of those flavors.
And if you did have the low sodium, you might need more table salt than
potentially,
for that, right?
Yep. And so, so we're going to let that go, and we're going to continue to cook this at a low simmer. And what I'm going to actually do is once it gets to a low simmer, we'll back the heat down a little bit, and I'm going to actually put the top on. And once we put the top on, we're going to let it just sit there and cook. And it may take, 15, 20 minutes, up to maybe even 30 to 40, depending on how soft you want to make this particular stew. So if you like it a little more al dente and a little bit, more texture to it, then you cook it a little less. And if you want it to be really nice and soft, you'd let it cook low and slow for much longer.
Gotcha. Does it need to come to a rolling boil before you put the lid on?
No, so you don't need to, for this particular one, you don't need to bring it to a rolling boil. You just want it to come to a nice simmer where you start to see maybe a little bit of bubbling coming in, and that's when you know that you can put your top on and break it and continue that cooking process, backing off your heat after that. Because once you put the top on, it actually will rise the heat even more, so that's why you just want to make sure that you back the heat off a little bit. So now that the soup is pretty much almost ready to eat, what we're going to actually do is we're going to take part of this out, and this is something we mentioned a little bit before. If you want to try to cream up the soup a little bit more, you can actually take some of it out and put it into a food processor like we're going to do right here. And that's just going to blend that up and make it kind of that creamy consistency. And we're not doing all of it because we do still want some of those hearty kind of chunks in there as well. If you have an immersion blender, this would be a good time to just put the immersion blender in there, turn it on for a little bit, and give you that consistency.
If you don't have a blender or something like that, if you have a potato masher, that would be a good thing. You can mash up a little bit of it in a bowl and then add it back in there as well.
All right, so now that it looks really good and Jackie's got it processed up, I'm gonna have him put it back into our soup. And so he's going to add this back to the soup and stir it in and check the consistency. Also, too, at this time, it's a great time to taste test if you want to taste and check the flavors to make sure if you need to add in a little bit of extra salt or some of your Cajun seasoning. And so we've already actually done that, and it's tasting really, really good. And then the last thing to do is we're going to add in the cheese. So the shredded cheese goes in at this point. And we don't want to put it in too early because it can potentially start to burn. It can potentially clog up the overall movement of the dish. And so we will put this in right towards the end. And if you'll notice too, you can add your cream later, and that will help to stop some of that congealing and some of those solids that are creating in there. But for this dish, we just decided we'd go with it, and it would be okay. All right, so we're finished up here with our dish, and we've actually went ahead and put some into the bowl ready for serving. And you'll notice that I actually have a little bit of fresh parsley here, as well as some extra cheese. And so these are things that you can garnish on the top and give it a little bit extra flavor. And some people really like that little bit of extra cheese.
Yeah, like I'm not the biggest cheese fan, so I'm not going to add any extra to mine. But you know, our friend Selena, she loves cheese, so let's load hers up for her.
That sounds great. Yeah, I know Selena's extra cheesy. Have you heard her dad jokes?
I sure have, and they are cheesy.
All right, so we're finished here with everything. We hope you give this a try, and feel free to modify this recipe to make it your own.
One last thing we do want to talk about is a little bit about cleanup. We did have on our stove a little bit of overflow when we put a lid on our pot. So please make sure you let your stove get completely cool and before you start trying to clean that up and get that off, and maybe work with your parent if you have any of those issues. We want to make sure that you're safe.
Absolutely. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Let's eat.